Good evening, everyone. My name is Professor Nola Hewitt-Dundas. I'm Professor of Innovation Management and Policy and Pro-Vice-Chancellor for the Faculty of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences here at Queen's University, Belfast. It comes down to me to have a great privilege tonight to welcome Hilary McGrady, Director General of the National Trust. This is part of the Chief Executives Club series of lectures, and it's going to be one of the highlights of our lecture series this year. And we are delighted to have you here, Hilary, for what will be, no doubt, a fascinating talk. Octavia Hill co-founded the National Trust in 1895, and at that time she talked about the universal need for access to nature and to beauty. And she fought to protect and create access to green spaces across the country. At Queen's, we're very aware of just how fortunate we are to have access to places such as this at Riddle Hall and to the Lanyon Building, which provide us with such splendid green spaces right here in the heart of South Belfast. Many of you will be aware of current developments on campus, and no doubt you will have noticed as you came in tonight our new building on this site at Riddle Hall and also the Student Centre. The importance that we place on balancing the needs and the expectations of 21st century students and staff, with being also the custodians of some of the city's most iconic and well-loved buildings and space. It's something that we do as a university take very seriously, and it's integral to the architectural design of our buildings. The evidence is compelling that green spaces play an important role in improving mental health and well-being. COVID-19 has most definitely brought the importance of having access to safe, shared spaces to prominence. However, the pandemic also made us much more aware that access to green spaces is not equal for everyone. Indeed, data for cities such as London highlight that the wealthiest areas have around 10% more public space compared to the most deprived areas. In addition, approximately half of the residents in the most deprived areas of London are from minority backgrounds. So the implications of this is that the location and the accessibility of green spaces is interrelated with socioeconomic characteristics, which then manifest themselves in health inequalities. Tonight, on the eve of an election, with cross-party support for increased investment in our health service, the contribution of higher education to economic and social outcomes must also be noted. Economically, with some 25,000 students, Queen's contributes 1.9 billion annually to the Northern Ireland economy. For every 1 million that's invested in research activity at Queen's, this generates an economic return of 3.9 million. Through education, we deliver skills that create our talented workforce, a major selling point for Northern Ireland. And through then research, we drive innovation, ensuring our companies are competitive globally. So investing in our universities is investing in our future, the future of our young people, the future of the economy, and that is the future of Northern Ireland. And we do this so that we can deliver prosperity today, but equally, it's about a legacy for tomorrow, something that resonates very much with the ethos of the National Trust. I'd like to introduce you briefly to our speaker tonight, Hilary McGrady, Director General of the National Trust. Born in Lisburn, no better place, Hilary originally trained in graphic design, and Hilary's career path started in the drinks industry in brand and marketing. In 1998, she moved to become director of a national arts charity and was seconded in 2002 to become CEO of Belfast's bid to become European Capital of Culture. She's worked for the Trust since 2006, since joining as Regional Director for Northern Ireland. Hilary later went on to become Regional Director for Wales and the London and the South East region, and in 2014 was appointed Chief Operating Officer, leading the operations and consultancy teams. In March 2018, she took on the role of Director General of the National Trust. The 125th anniversary of the National Trust was celebrated in 2020, and Hilary announced the organisation's commitment to reach net zero by 2030, including the planting of 20 million trees and the establishment of green corridors that would connect urban areas with the countryside. I'm sure I speak for us all in saying that we're delighted, Hilary, to have you join with us tonight for this lecture series. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Hilary McGrady, Director General of the National Trust, to deliver her Chief Executives Club lecture, The Importance of Shared Spaces, Our Common Need for Nature, Beauty and History. Hilary.
Good evening, everybody. I'm going to start with a little film. So, I'm not sure I need to say much more because I think that film almost sums up just about everything that I plan to say in the next 30 minutes. But I'll come back to some of the detailing behind it. I do want to start by first of all saying how pleased I am to be here. Trust me, if anybody asks me to talk about the National Trust, nothing makes me happier. I can literally talk about it 24/7 and nothing gives me more joy except being able to talk about it here in my own patch. As Nola said, I'm from Northern Ireland. I'm born and I'm bred in Northern Ireland, and I'm very, very proud of the fact that I'm the first Director General to be from this lovely province. I am here to talk about all of the things that we've just covered in that little film. It summarises what the National Trust is about. In this increasingly pressurised, mad, busy world, the importance of access to space, to nature, to quiet, to all of those things that you said has become ever more apparent, ever more needed, and honestly something that I have been passionate about really since the day I was born. And so I'm going to talk to you about that a little bit this evening. I'm going to give you a bit of a whistle-stop tour. I always think it's important to give you an essence of me, who's speaking to you, and why does this matter to me at all. I'll tell you a little bit about me. I'll also tell you a little bit about the National Trust. Much as I would like to think that you're all members, certainly you'll want to be members by the time you leave, I'll not make that assumption, but I think it is worth just walking you through a little bit about the organisation, what it does, why it does it, to give you the context for why this particular subject is so central to what we do and why it is important. I'm going to talk through what we've been doing as an organisation and some of the barriers and challenges that we've faced. And then I'll spend a little bit of time talking through the things that we have done to try to get over those barriers. But I'm really interested genuinely in your thoughts at the end of it and your questions as to, are those the right things? Are there other things we should be thinking about? Are you pleased with what we've been doing, or are you disappointed? I'm very, very up for hearing all of that and everything in between. So to start with, a little bit about me. Well, the reason I have this photograph behind me is because it's where I live. I am fortunate to be able to live somewhere that is in the middle of nature. Nature has always been important to me. Having access to green space has just been incredibly important. And I live in what was Lockkeeper's House on Lagan Canal, what used to be the Lagan Canal. And the reason it looks lovely is actually nothing to do with me. It's all to do with my husband. He cares for it. I get to really enjoy it, and I do enjoy it. It's my place of escape. It's my place of refuge. But I am really mindful of the fact that I have a privilege to have access to that. And it has been my life's work to try to make sure that more people have more access to green space and to nature, because I believe so strongly in its restorative qualities. As Nola said, without going through my whole career again, this has been really important to me. As a young child, I was born, most people might know, on White Mountain, which was it's called a mountain, it's really a hill. It's the first of the Belfast hills. The next one is Black Mountain, Divis, and so on. And as a child, I spent hours, literally hours, disappearing over White Mountain, roaming around with my dog. That was the lovely heady days when my mother didn't know where I'd gone and she wasn't worried. Why would she be? But there was a really interesting thing, because while I was able to roam, I was only able to roam so far, because at the top of White Mountain, I could see Divis, I could see Black Mountain, but I wasn't able to go there. And I'll come back to why I wasn't able to go there in a moment, but it was always something that I was always curious about. I always asked Mum, well, why can I not go there? And she said, you don't need to know, you're just not going there. I did go one day, and it scared the life out of myself, because I was walking along and actually a bush moved. And it turned out that it was an army patrol on manoeuvres, and trust me, I didn't go back there anytime soon. I'm not sure who was more frightened, whether it was them or me. But I didn't know why I couldn't go there, but I'll come back to that story. So nature, wildlife, and everything else was a big part of my world, but so was arts and culture. If I think back on it, it was probably my mum's mechanism to keep me out of everything else that was going on in the world. I was brought up during the Troubles, like I'm sure quite a few of you. So those two things were really important all the way through my childhood, and which then propelled me into a career, first in graphic design, then into marketing, but then ultimately came back into the arts sector, because that's sort of where my heart is. Despite those two things, nature and culture and arts being really important to me, the National Trust didn't feature in my world at all. For all sorts of reasons, I suspect. It didn't feel like an organisation for me. I certainly wasn't from a family who spent their Sundays roaming around National Trust properties. It felt quite remote, it felt quite expensive. And my first introduction to the Trust was, as I think about 15, I was taken there on a school trip. I went to a Protestant school trip, so only Protestant schools went to National Trust properties. I did think it was an amazing place. I remember being completely blown away by the art there. I hadn't had access to real art up until that point. It was my first introduction to stubs. If you've ever been there, they have the most stunning Hambletonian stub painting, just amazing. But I still came away from Mount Stuart feeling as if it wasn't a place for me. I remember a very scary woman in a cardigan and very sensible shoes telling me not to touch anything, and I came away thinking. So that was my introduction to the National Trust, and I didn't hear of it again, despite really going through into working for Arts and Business, which worked with lots of cultural organisations and sort of slightly skirted around National Trust because it didn't really want to play, and went on into the drinks industry and then back into the arts again. But my next introduction to the National Trust was when I saw this on the TV. Now, if you were able to see out the window, you'd be able to see this scene, only not with as many masts, because this is Divis. This is Divis taken in 2004. And on the news came up this story, it was just after the Good Friday Agreement, that the National Trust, of all the most unlikely organisations, had taken on the ownership of Divis. Now, this was the Divis that during my childhood I was never able to go to. Probably one of the most contested spaces in the whole of Northern Ireland. Disliked for all sorts of reasons. by many people, particularly the West Belfast community, and certainly a place of no-go. And here was this unlikely organisation, an English, perceived to be English organisation, stepping into the breach and saying, we are going to make this place a place for everyone. And that, for me, was just the most extraordinary thing. I just couldn't quite believe that this organisation was willing to do this, and that the MOD was actually backing off and saying, we're handing it back to the nation from whence it came, back to the community, and we're putting it in the safe hands of the National Trust because we think they'll do a good job on this. And from that moment, I thought this has to be an organisation that I want to work with. And from there, became the regional director for Northern Ireland. And so, fast forward 15 years later, and I deliberately took this photograph because kind of this is Divis at its best. Very cold, very wet quite often, but absolutely glorious. Last year, we welcomed over 300,000 people, we reckon, it's hard to count them all, to the slopes of Divis. People from all over the country, all over the city, all shapes and sizes and backgrounds and interests. And nobody cares who they are or what their background is, because this is an equal, lovely, shared space. It's amazing for people, it's also amazing for nature, it's also amazing for carbon capture. It's just the most extraordinary space, and I am immensely proud of what the Trust has achieved. Nothing to do with my vision, I would have to say, all to do with the people on the ground, the local community and the teams that work with them, making this place an extraordinary place. You're going to hear me talk about Divis a lot because it's I think, a really great case study of what is possible and why shared space like this is something that the Northern Ireland in particular needs more of. But just reel back for a moment, to go back to the National Trust and why the National Trust and why this organisation fits so closely with what's important to me. And to this woman, this is Octavia Hill, the original founder. I really wish I'd met her. She sounds extraordinary. She was a massively determined social activist. Long before she created the National Trust, she was doing social housing before anybody had even thought about it. She was finding ways to engage people who were homeless in ways that they could generate their own income to be able to get their own home. She was just quite amazing. But she had this deeply held belief that regardless to who you were, what your background was, you had a human right to have access to beauty. Fundamentally beauty, and in her world beauty was about being in the outdoors, was about having access to nature, and that sense of social justice and wanting everyone to share in that was incredibly important to her. And that spirit lives on in the Trust today. She set out very clearly with that ambition to be about space actually and about the outdoors. It wasn't about everything else. It wasn't about houses and everything else I'm going to come on to talk about. It was about space, and for the first 40 odd years that's where they focused on. She could not begin, I'm guessing, to have imagined what the Trust would be like 127 years later. We are now an organisation that looks after, cares for, makes accessible over 300 of these sort of what we would call mansion houses, but really they're everything from huge mansion houses to tiny cottages. We've got from Craigside in Northumbria in the far left corner there to Hilltop, which is the home of Beatrix Potter in the Lake District. This is Powell's Castle, and that's the remains of an old lead mine in southwest. So we've got this massive portfolio of properties that tell you the story of these islands and the history that embeds itself in these islands. And it is extraordinary, and it's an extraordinary privilege to be the person that stands at the shoulders of all of those that came before me to hopefully pass this organisation on in the future. We own 750 miles of coastline across England, Wales and Northern Ireland. Scotland has their own National Trust. 250,000 hectares, that's a lot of land, nearly all farmed, but all accessible. And we welcomed this is before COVID, about 20 million visitors to these types of properties, but more in the region of 200 million people walk our land, our coastline every year. She could never have imagined how successful it would be, and it's only successful because the nation needs it and wants it. We respond to what the nation needs of us, and that is how it's always been. In a Northern Ireland context, of course, you'll recognise some of these, some of the best known places and iconic places that we're all proud to have in in our region. So obviously the Giant's Causeway, before COVID again, welcomed over 1 million people, I think, in 2019. Mount Stewart, exceptional in terms of its house and of course its garden, but actually the history that this place tells, European, as well as a British and an Irish history that's just extraordinary. The Crown Bar. Not everybody knows that we own the Crown Bar. Think of thousands of people that walk over that crown. If you look at the inverted crown that's on the floor as you walk over, that was a deliberate thing that they did at the time. And then possibly the Director General of the National Trust is not allowed to have a favourite property, but Crom is my favourite property. Just the most beautiful, tranquil, absolutely stunning place, I think, in the whole planet. So we own a lot, we have a lot of responsibility, but what I would say is that what we're focused on is actually our charitable purpose, which is to promote the permanent preservation of places of historic and natural beauty for the benefit of the nation. And there's a couple of words there that are really important to me. Promote is one. It's not just about caring for our places, important as that is and central to what we do, but the promotion of the care of them is equally important to try to engender people's understanding of why these places matter, why shared spaces matter, why we should care for them. And then the other word that's important is for the nation. We're here for everyone. I love my members. We've got nearly 6 million of them. They're incredibly important to me, but actually our charitable purpose is to be here for the nation. So those things, promotion, care, and for the nation, guide everything that we do. But as I say, the trust from the word go was actually about outdoors. It was about space, it was about land, and initially very much focused on the big iconic areas. This is the Lake District and one of the highest peaks in the list, it's Scarfield Pike. And that continued to be the case for about 40 odd years, 50 odd years. The big change came just post World War II, when, for obvious reasons, these big estates sadly were broken up because of the war in many cases. Either they lost their money for obvious reasons, and actually sadly they often lost their heirs. You know, whole families wiped out because of the war. And there was a point at which there was one of these buildings, one of these extraordinary places, being demolished every week. And so the trust rose to what the nation needed of it at that time and started to really step in and take these buildings on. It was part of a government scheme that was in lieu of taxes at the time, hugely successful, and has managed to care for places that may well have been demolished. Fast forward again into the 1950s, and again the nation said, actually, we have a new problem here. Our coastline is being completely wrecked. Again, the result of industrial revolution and absolute rampant development, particularly along our coastline, not just because of that, but also because of tourism, a lot of our coastline being wrecked. And of course, we're an island nations. And again, we stepped in. We now own 750 miles. We launched a fundraising campaign called Enterprise Neptune, which to date has raised about 90 million since that time to buy, to protect, and to keep open our coastal sites. And then into the sort of 70s, 80s, 90s, actually, we have this huge portfolio of properties, but we turned our attention to the nation part of our charitable purpose. How do we engage more people in what we do and how we do it? And we had a big programme of developing audiences, in different audiences from different backgrounds, huge focus around families. And that is what resulted in the 6 million member growth, because in year 2000 we had about 2 million, and we've now just short of 6 million. So it's been an incredibly successful story. And we went into 2020 feeling rather pleased. We were just about to celebrate 125 years anniversary. We had just had our best year ever in terms of fundraising and visitors. We just announced things like net zero targets and 20 million trees. I was feeling pretty sure. I was in my second year of being Director General. And then COVID happened. And of course, just like everybody else, COVID was pretty devastating for the Trust. First time I had to close our entire portfolio in its history. That was extraordinarily difficult. I was also looking into having a £200 million deficit in 1 year. And given in that month, and I remember it well, in April, I was looking at a pay bill of 25 million in 1 month. And furlough hadn't been announced at that point. I was looking at the prospect of being the Director General who was going to oversee the demise of the National Trust, and that was not a pretty moment, I can tell you. Having said all of that, what COVID did, and every cloud does have a silver lining, what COVID did do was shine a light on just how important our places were. People came from far and wide once they could. People came from far and wide, thousands of them coming to our places. Now, this photograph is actually a park, but people, of course, when they had nothing else they could do, they found the outdoors. And they kept finding out the outdoors. They didn't just come once, they kept coming back. They actually really liked it. They loved getting close to nature. And it became a real and a very, very important part of people's lives. And we have all sorts of stats. Nuala referred to some of them, and we have more here. Before COVID, 28% of the population in Northern Ireland regularly walked in the outdoors. During COVID, up to 63%. And we know, and the stat isn't here, but we know we've held on to a lot of those people. It's probably in the region about 50% still regularly going into the outdoors. More importantly, possibly, they felt the benefits of it. 89% saying that it made them feel more calm and refreshed. 84% saying they felt physically better. And importantly for us, 79% saying that it made them feel closer to nature. One of our own objectives to try to engage people, promote the need to care for these places. So there was something really quite important coming out of COVID that we learned a lesson from. We certainly felt it in a very real sense. A lot of our properties were completely overrun with visitors. This is again Divis, people trying to find places to park, not sustainable at all. Of course, everybody driving to our places, which felt really uncomfortable, but on the whole, amazing to see so many people join us. And then the other silver lining that came out of it was definitely this thing about people grasping that nature really mattered. Now, this coincided, of course, with things like COP26, all of the talk around climate change, all of these things starting to matter. And actually, people were weaving these things into, this stuff matters. My life is made better by this. And so we really saw an increased interest, particularly from families, with people wanting to get closer to nature. But as Nuala said earlier, without a doubt, the other thing it put a light on was the fact that access was not equal. The more urban you were, the more in a deprived area you were, the less access you had and the less benefits in terms of well-being that you could avail of. That was writ large across the whole of the country, and consistently through all of the research, when people were asked what is important to you, actual access to nature, access to green space consistently came to the top of people's list, even when they were saying, well, we want health support, we want community support. Actually, this kept coming top of the list. Interestingly, in a Northern Ireland context, you have another layer of challenge, which is interesting, and this is historical. It's to do with our own planning and to do with land ownership. In England, we have right to roam. I'm sure that's familiar to quite a lot of you. The historic right to be able to walk along the byways that have been there since ancient times. Due to our history of planning, actually the vast majority of our land is in private ownership and you can't access it. The protected right-of-ways here are tiny compared to England, Wales, or indeed Scotland. So actually it's really difficult if you live in a rural area to walk legally on someone's land. You do actually have quite good access in somewhere like Belfast, but actually elsewhere it's really poor. So there's significantly less access to green space in this country. So having dealt with shared access in an environmental or an outdoor sense, I want to turn briefly to shared history and why that matters. Shared access outside is great for our well-being, for our sense of balance in the world. Shared understanding and acknowledgement of history and heritage is equally important to our sense of identity, to our sense of community and our connectedness and what makes us. Our history tells us where we have come from, but it also helps us understand where we're trying to go to. And of course, we know that all, don't we? We know that very, very clearly. The Trust has known this for a long time too. And it is fair to say, and I'm always honest about this, we have for many, many years told a fairly binary story, a rather lovely Downton Abbey kind of story of our houses and how lovely everything was. It was probably not until about the 50s that we even ventured into the downstairs story about the servants. We really only wanted to tell the nice story about the lovely family that owned it and what they did with their wealth. We then started to talk about the servants, and more we talked about maybe the craftspeople that had actually built or contributed to the collections. Having said that, by 2008, and it was the anniversary of the abolition of slavery, we said, actually, there's a whole lot of other stories here that we have not told, and it is time to bring those stories to the fore. And this is Penryn Castle in North Wales, infamous for a number of reasons, not least the fact it was built actually in the early 1800s to look like a Norman castle, because that's what you did with your wealth. You just wanted to look big and rich. But their wealth, that we had really never discussed where it came from two sources. One was from a sugar plantation in Jamaica, which involved, of course, thousands and thousands of slaves. And actually, a huge amount of their wealth came from a local slate mine, which is literally about 2 miles from this castle, where the local community, the vast majority of the local community, were employed in atrocious conditions with very little pay, and to this day rankles with the local community, and this is generations on. Not least because their conditions were so bad, they had a strike. And it was one of those awful situations that the family ignored it, faced it down. Half of the village went back to work and half didn't. And to this day, families still don't talk to each other because of that. But this property became a focal point for hatred. Literally, the community would not go over the doorstep of this property. And so we faced into the fact that we needed to tell these stories about slavery, but also about effectively slavery on their own doorstep. And in 2008, we started that process. And actually, having done a pretty good job there, actually the community are now engaged. They're now really starting to embrace their history. They see their history presented in this house. It built our confidence to be able to explore slavery and colonialism a bit more. And then this happened. We produced the slavery report, which became, I'm sure some of you will be aware. It was published in October 2020. And it was on the back of the work that we'd done at Penryn. We decided to look into connections with our other properties, and we published the report. Now, we did anticipate that there would be pushback, because nobody really wants their bubble burst, do they? If they have a notion of what history, their version of history, they don't want that rattled. What we didn't anticipate was just how divisive this issue would be, and how people came from such clearly different perspectives. And you know, I don't consider myself to be naive, but this was definitely off the Richter scale. What it did do, though, was make this a subject of national debate. And actually, I'm rather proud of that, because it was a debate that needed to be had. Actually, interestingly, we were behind the curve in doing this work. Lots of other cultural institutions had already been doing this. But for, I'm assuming, reasons of scale, reasons of awareness, definitely the media chose us to be a sort of a whipping post for it. It has calmed down now, but the debate continues to rumble on, and we have learned lots of lessons from it, but I'm really interested in your perspective on what we did well, what we didn't do well. Of course, Northern Ireland has its own version of some of these contested histories that we will need to think really carefully about how we want to interweave those stories with the existing interpretation we have. And this is the very beautiful Spring Hill from Moneymore, which is a fabulous, beautiful property, a plantation house, that again we tell quite a simple binary story about the history of the family, and less about what plantation meant, what the consequences of that were, and so on. So it's something we're going to continue to work on. So those are the challenges, I guess, that we've faced around ensuring we have shared space and we have shared cultural space. I want to talk a little bit now about some of the ways in which we are addressing that and capturing, I think, the opportunity rather than thinking of it as a challenge. And just to run you through, we have 7 things that we try to consider when we're trying to do this, whether it's outdoors or indoors. Very quickly, little case study. This is Derrimore, just on the edge of Bestbrook. A very contested little village, a tricky community. And this little place was sat in the middle of it, a little oasis. Well, you could call it oasis. Actually, for the local community, they felt as if it was a gated community that they weren't welcome in. No one from the local community ever really used either the building or indeed the parkland and garden. To the credit of the local team, they tried to invert what the trust is about. And instead of this being a house that you can come into, they said, actually, community, what do you want to do with this space? Starting with the community is principle number 1. Don't start with what you want to do, start with what the community wants of you. Now, if you were to go there, this place has been transformed. We've got a new play area. The community didn't have a play area for their children. There's a really great, safe, circular walk that people of all ages and abilities can use. There's lots of little community groups, from disability groups to old people coming in and using this space in a really active way. The place has come to life. As a consequence, it's looked after better because people are engaged, they love it. So community first is sort of principle number one. Principle number two is definitely partnership. So this again is Divis. And I'm, as I say, immensely proud of what we have achieved there, but we didn't and don't and will not achieve anything unless we do it in partnership. And so this is just a small, and you don't need to see them all, but this is just a small selection of the partners that we have worked to make Divis what it is today. And I'm immensely proud of the partnership work that we've done. And some people are in Woodland Trust are here tonight. Belfast Hills Partnership have been enormously supportive of our work there. And that will have to continue to be the case, because again, this is not about the National Trust. This is about access for everybody and feeling in partnership with all of the groups that work there. Third principle is actually keep it simple and put access first. Without access, actually nothing else works. So if somebody can't get into your building, you can talk about being emotionally engaged all you like, but if they can't get in, it's going to be a problem. So again, we've worked in partnership with lots of different groups who have helped us think about how can we be more accessible physically, emotionally, financially in some cases. And this is a lovely little, partnership with an organisation called Molly May, and we've worked with them to make Port Stewart Strand a fully accessible beach. And I think I'm enormously proud of this, because beaches are really inaccessible for people with disabilities. So really putting access to the front, and that applies to getting people to your properties as well. Again, back to Divis, lovely little partnership with TransLink, where we're physically trying to ensure that we've got a bus to enable people to get to Divis, people who don't have access to a car. Clearly more sustainable, better for the climate, better for congestion, better for the local community. All sorts of reasons why this is good, but access is king. Our fourth one is being an enabler. So it's not actually always about our place and the shared space. It is enabling others to enjoy the space on their terms and in the way they want. This is us being part of a cultural programme called Green Space, Dark Sky. I think there's a question from someone about using illumination in dark areas. But it's a lovely example. Actually, this is the Giant's Ring. It's not our space, but we're working with them on finding ways, again, to enable people to come into a shared space, enjoy it on their terms. So being an enabler and not always the deliverer seems to be a really important principle. Learning from others, key for the trust. Certainly there would have been a time where the trust really knew better. We have scale, we have scope, we have money. We don't really need to work with other people. Well, absolutely other people do an awful lot of work better than we do. And to commend the museums here, I think their work on bringing the Troubles to life, to do that sympathetically and with great sensitivity is something that we have already been learning from and certainly would want to continue. And we do that with a lot of other groups. And then the last one is probably, and this is my last thought, it's the willingness to see beyond your own boundaries. So the Trust has for years, and this is where Octavia and I possibly part company a little bit, she focused very much on ownership. The only way to make sure that this place would be cared for forever was to own it. So we have a thing called inalienability, so that when the National Trust owns something, we can't sell it again. Once it's inalienable, it's ours. And actually it would take an act of Parliament to take it off us again, and that is a huge strength. But actually it is also a limiting factor, because you could then become just a bunch of oases around the country. So what we're increasingly looking at doing is working with others beyond our own boundaries, finding new ways to bring green space to people, finding new ways to connect our places and other places so that you start to get corridors. So in 2020, when I announced Green Corridor, this was in my mind. This is Castlefield Viaduct, which is right in the heart of Manchester city centre. Old viaduct that was been derelict for 50 odd years, still being maintained by the public purse. So your money is going to keeping this thing. So I figure if your money's going to it, it should be delivering some public benefit. We're going to change this into a Highline Park. I don't know if anybody's been to New York. It's a little mini version, just to manage expectation. It's only about 600 metres long. But it's going to open on a pilot basis in the middle of June. It's highly improbable. To be honest, I never thought I'd actually get this one pulled off, because we still don't own it, still owned by National Rail. Everybody said it'll never happen, this won't happen. It's going to open in June. We have to raise a lot of money for it, but what more importantly about this is going to be the start of a green corridor, or a green and blue corridor. They have a wonderful network of canals in Manchester, and the canal that runs under this takes you out ultimately into the country. So I want to be able this to be the trailhead for a green corridor out into Manchester, and it's going to be one of 20, hopefully, around the country. So that's my last principle. Think big, think beyond your own boundaries, and who knows what could happen. And in my last, and I have to finish with Divis again, what could possibly happen? So forever and ever and ever, myself, Belfast Hills, many, many partners have wanted to realise the ambition of being able to walk from Divis to Cave Hill. Free access all the way. And we haven't managed to do that in my lifetime. And I think that's kind of sad, and I think it's an indictment on us. Surely to goodness, this iconic bit of landscape that edges our city, we should be able to do that. Now, we are going to play our part, and I'm really confident that we'll be able to join acquisitions up over time, and we're working with the Woodland Trust and many other partners. But wouldn't that be amazing if we could deliver that sort of vision? And so I leave you with this. We all want quiet, and we all want beauty, but we all need space. Thank you.
What a wonderful talk, and so many different things to pick up on now. And we've about 15 minutes or so for some questions. Hilary, thank you. That has been inspiring. The passion, the energy, if anybody can make that happen, I think you can. I'm going to start off with one question from Christopher Slater, who's asked me to ask it on his behalf. He's retired, but was previously in the Chief Architect's branch in the Department of Finance. And you picked up a little bit on it in terms of woodland. So the question is, the tree coverage in Northern Ireland's region is about 8%, well below that in Europe. So what is the National Trust doing to promote increased coverage of trees? I suppose particularly in light of my opening statements about the vision in 2020 pre-COVID, the net zero, the green corridors, I suppose that's feeding into the space. To what extent have you been hampered in the delivery of that vision because of the pandemic?
Yeah, so you're right. You're absolutely right. 8%. Well, we think that that's the number. I was actually talking. Ian McCurley is here from the Woodland Trust, and we were just debating whether we need to reassess the whole of Northern Ireland to see how accurate. Could be lower, could be higher. There's been a lot changed since that survey was done. Our commitment absolutely is the 20 million trees, of which Northern Ireland is 120,000. Yes. 125, very important, 125,000. Heather is the Regional Director for Northern Ireland. So we're going to be playing our part, but what I would say is it is about trees, but do you know what? It's just equally about hedgerows. It's about making sure that we create an environment where nature can thrive. We want to be ever more active in that, and we're really keen to work with anybody that wants to work with us. The beauty of the Trust is that we own land. A lot of people want to plant trees, but they don't have the land. We have the land. And I think that's an incredibly, important thing that we can do. We have to be really sensitive to that. Right tree, right place. We have to be careful about the aesthetics of it, but we're really active. It's good for carbon, it's good for nature, and ultimately it's good for people. So really, really keen to do more on it.
Okay, so we've plenty of opportunities for questions. So if you would like to raise your hand, there's a roving mic, which we will bring to you. I'm sure there's going to be no shortage of questions tonight. Ooh. Perhaps you'd just be kind enough just to let us know who you are and sort of the organisation.
My name's Bridget Mcdonald, and I currently work as a volunteer in Castle Ward in the garden. I've been there a number of years now, and prior to COVID we used to have regular school kids arrive in buses to visit, some of them from, as you've said in your talk, from disadvantaged housing that, like yourself when you were a kid, arrived and it was their opportunity to walk and see things. So that has since stopped the education aspect of kids arriving and their teachers. I've a couple of friends who refer to not been able to access National Trust properties now with the children, and there's a number of staff within Castle Ward who would have been employed, but also volunteer staff who would have come in to do training with the school kids. The whole education sector has ended at Castle Ward.
Yeah.
So I'm interested to understand why that has happened. It seemed to just start as COVID came, and then if you go online, it seems at the current situation, schools aren't able to access it.
Yeah. So sadly, our schools programme, as you describe, was one of the casualties of our own cost cutting. I didn't go into the detail of that, but I did mention a £200 million gap that we had to solve in that year. It was actually more than that. It was 227 million, to be exact. And unfortunately, our schools programme, along with many others, we had to make nearly 1,800 people redundant, and our schools programme was part of that. I would say we have taken the opportunity to review how do we engage young people more generally now, because we see clearly we are trying to future-proof. It's my job to make sure the trust can continue forever. And we've reviewed what we need to do about young people. In some cases, we are looking to bring back school visits, but on the whole, we're going to focus on young people more generally. So actually, Mount Stewart has been designated as our children and young people hub. We're doing that gently, because what I can't have, having gone through the pain of making all these people redundant and all of these changes, I don't want to just balloon back or go back to exactly where we are. We acknowledge absolutely young people and school children in particular are going to be important. We're starting with these hubs around the country to see what works. So we've employed a small team centrally to work with the local team to see what works. And I fully acknowledge, because my own children went to Castle Ward and have really fond memories of it. So I really acknowledge how good it was. I can't tell you that we're going to go back to that, but what I absolutely can guarantee is that we're going to do more work with young people, particularly in the next sort of 3-4 years of our next iteration of our strategy. Heather's here, and if you want to talk to her maybe over the break and give you a bit more detail of that. But broadly speaking, a commitment, yes. Unlikely to go back to the existing or the old style approach to it before. Yeah.
Okay. Next question. Well, then I'm going to jump in with one which we have. Maybe Arthur Evans is in the room. No? Okay, so I'll ask it on behalf of Arthur then. It's around, maybe less relevant in Northern Ireland, but it's about the National Trust and English heritage. So the question is, although I accept the idea wouldn't be much advantage to Northern Ireland-based members, has the National Trust ever spoken with English Heritage about combined membership packages with a view to boosting membership for both organisations and expanding National Trust membership in areas that have fewer NT properties, such as East Kent?
Yeah, so I do get asked this quite a lot. We have talked about it many a time. We haven't gone there, I have to be honest. It is in effect a competing organisation now. We do work really closely with them because actually in several sites we co-run them. So places like Hadrian's Wall, it's a site that is run by both ourselves and English Heritage, as is Stonehenge. On balance, we generally we haven't gone so far as to have joint membership. Equally, a lady asked me earlier about Hillsborough Castle. It's run by Royal Historic Palaces. So we don't have joint membership. It might be something that we consider in the future. We do have a reciprocal agreement with National Trust Scotland and in fact with international national trusts. So if you are a member of the National Trust, you can get into many different historic places across the world. Actually, I think it was 72 countries that we're affiliated with, but not with those particular two. But we do have a very friendly relationship with them, I would say.
That's great. Good to hear. Yes, down at the back.
Hello, Chris McCracken from Lennon Quarter Business Improvement District. Thanks very much for the talk. It was very inspiring. I love the move into place management that you're considering. I think that's really ambitious and exciting. My question is just about the urban environment. National Trust is maybe considered a more rural countryside, but most people live in cities, and a lot of the heritage of cities is under threat. Have the National Trust considered an urban strategy to rescue some of the Victorian and 20th century assets that we have?
Yeah, no, really good question, and something that's really live at the moment. You're absolutely right, and really to expand on that, the Trust is really keen to go to where people are. And of course, the majority of people live in urban areas, and we are not well represented. You're right, we have some amazing properties in really quite dense areas, some in London. The Beatles houses, not everybody knows we own the Beatles houses. In Liverpool, just a small example of those. But overall, our representation is low. That is why the viaduct is really important to me. So we absolutely have considered what role can we play, and we've actually been piloting lots of different interventions over the years. If I'm being really honest, and Heather will know this, I put a call out, when I first became Director General, I put a call out to say, historic buildings in urban areas are the ones that we really ought to be interested in. And it's interesting because actually it was Nuala actually referred to it, most of the really important ones are already cared for, either through public authority or individual trusts or whatever. So actually I thought there was going to be a deluge, and genuinely there wasn't. And those that came forward tend to be not very interesting and difficult for us to see what role we would play. So that's why I slightly changed tack to say, well, what would urban people really benefit from? And that's why the green space and the green corridors became more of a focus, because heritage is actually really quite well attended to by all of the various agencies. Now, I would never say never, and occasionally properties do come up, and we would certainly consider it, but that isn't where our focus is just at the moment. So.
Yes, another one down at the back.
Yeah, thanks also, Hilary, for that great talk. I'm Sarah Lappin. I am in architecture at Queen's. And I think that what the National Trust has done over recent years about telling stories that we hadn't heard before is really commendable. Thank you so much, and please continue. I don't want quiet. I want to hear more of those stories. A lot of my research looks at architectural history and sound, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you're telling those stories, the technology maybe that you're using to tell those stories. I think that'd be really interesting to hear about that. Thanks.
Yeah, so a really good point, and I would love to be able to say we're doing loads. We're not doing anything close to what we should be doing. So we're just coming to the end, into the final phases of our existing strategy. I don't want to bore you with business plans, but that's just the reality, where our focus has been around what we're doing on land, what we're doing with cultural stories. We're just about to start to think about where we're going next. And to continue with the theme of access, without doubt, we cannot reach the number of people we need to reach if we think they all have to come to us. It's not sustainable. So actually actual access in all of its various guises has to be the route that we explore. We're only in the foothills of that. We have a website, we have various, and actually, like many cultural organisations, COVID fast-forwarded some of that. You can now do a virtual tour of our places. You can have a talk with our head gardener online, all of those things. But it's still really early days. So I would say watch this space. In the next 3-5 years, we'll really be developing that. Our actual technology can't cope with doing much more at the moment, but we are in the process of developing that. But it's absolutely essential to access in the round, I would say, apart from anything else. But the sound piece is really interesting from a historic interpretation point of view. Sound and telling stories is absolutely central. People wanting to read stuff is largely something of the past. Yeah.
Yes.
Hello, my name is Xi Wang, and I'm a researcher at Queen's. And thank you so much for your very interesting and insightful talk. Because of my own research is in relation to museum accessibilities for blind and partially sighted people. And also you mentioned about the accessible green spaces, and especially for the people with disabilities. So I'm interested in what kind of the facilities or technologies or plans is in National Trust to make the green spaces is more accessible for primarily the blind and partially sighted visitors.
Okay, thank you for that. I mean, this is very central to what we're working on right now. Access in its widest sense is really key. We have a programme internally, it's a bit sort of W1A speak, but Everyone Welcome explains what we're trying to do around all of these issues around access. And access to green space is actually very underdeveloped. That's been something we've probably only coming to realise ourselves. We've focused very heavily on the basics around paths. You need a path to be able to get on. But actually it's much more than that. And so things like that partnership that's made Port Stewart Strand accessible, what we have come to realise is don't try to fix it yourself. Work with the people who know and have already got experience of making places accessible. So that has been a bit of a breakthrough for us. So in all over the country now we're getting groups with various disabilities to come to us. So Alzheimer's Society coming to us, Autism Society, people with hearing and sight impairments coming to us and telling us what they need. Technology is playing a part, but I actually would say keep it simple. We have a habit of trying to jump to the thing that's really difficult, when in fact, get your paths sorted, get trampers available, make sure that you've got your ramps looking beautiful. But there, you know, we had a wonderful talk by, I'm sure you know, Tanny Gray Thompson, the Olympian. She was at a conference last week, and she said, actually, all I want to do is be able to get in. And I was one of those, you know, just keep it simple in the first instance, but be really mindful not to try to fix the problem yourself. Use other people who have that life experience to help you solve the problem. Does that make sense? Really happy for you to, if you want to talk to us, because we've got a really big programme of this going on around the country. We invested $2.5 million last year in just all those basic things that you've described. So we're very happy to talk to you about that. Yeah. Oh,
Yes,
you're warming
maybe
up now.
one last question. And it's only getting going now.
There's two, yeah.
Two, we can do
Hello,
two then.
I'm Fiona Kenny, Principal of St Ronan's College in Lurgan. I'm maybe following on from what you were saying earlier about access to young people. I think post-pandemic we're all seeing in schools the anxiety levels and the impact it's had on our young people, and trying to hand over these open spaces and giving our young people and children access to open space for their well-being and giving them ownership of it. And I think one of the successes of Divis and Black Mountain is particularly that it's so simple.
Yes.
It is a path
Yes.
through the hills, and just in all weathers, the crowds that are flocking to that because it's right on the doorstep. And rather than, maybe I totally understand as somebody has to manage a big budget, that programme would be cut, that maybe some outreach work and looking at project-based learning in our schools to ask our young people in all areas. I'm in quite a very interesting environment where I work. I'm from Belfast, but in Lurgan there's areas of sort of, you know, austerity and maybe disadvantage, but also wealthier areas but to look at the townlands around, to let our young people look at their local space and look at their area rather than looking on a screen, to look beyond themselves locally. And if there was an educational outreach officer who could possibly work with schools, and that might be one for the region, just to try and get that work going again. I think it's really key. We're really struggling in schools at the minute, and I've talked to a lot of colleagues where we're trying to manage the anxiety of our young people post-pandemic and their mental health, and it would be great if National Trust could support our work.
Yeah, I'm definitely keen to find, I mean, there's going to be all sorts of different ways. I totally understand what you're saying about, I was talking to somebody else earlier about, we haven't even started to see the impact of COVID roll through with our kids coming through school and the experience they've had. So I definitely think there is a role for us. Outreach is definitely one part. We used to have quite an active outreach programme. A lot of that had to be cut. So we're just trying to reform what works best where, because we've got these hubs all around the country and they're all doing something slightly different. And Divis is perfect. And we were up there only, two weeks ago now, time flies. And they were talking about how they could engage local communities and schools in particular, how they wouldn't always have to come to us, but we could go to them. So we're definitely up for it. It's just early days again. There's one more question.
Thank you so much. Really enjoyed your presentation, and I'm lucky enough I look out my kitchen window and I see Divis. Well, unless the rain's rolling, I see it every day, so it was lovely to see it reflected so many times. So I work in biomedical sciences here in Queen's, and it's so relevant. Earlier today I heard a student talking about the prescription of time she focused on urban spaces, but I suppose I was interested to know if the National Trust currently works, it leads on from the schools questions, but the flip side, do you work with any community partners, community groups, looking at trying to prevent cognitive decline in older generations? And it's through the time in green space that I would be thinking about.
So we have a partnership already with the Alzheimer's Society to do exactly that, actually. So very active with groups coming to us using memory boxes, using all sorts of, you know, carers coming in free, all of that type of thing. Clearly given an age group that would, associate with our houses and have those memories and be able to, associate with them. It's been a really successful partnership. It does mean that we've been putting training in place for our own staff as to be Alzheimer friendly. And it's been a really successful partnership that I'd like to see grow. We do other things like we host men sheds around the country, and that's also been a really successful programme. So we have a number of different things going on, and of course lots of community groups using Derrimore is a good example, where local community groups, people with Alzheimer's and other challenges actually using our places because it's such a safe environment. I had a lovely meeting with, there was a whole bunch of carers, and in this case it was young people with disabilities, just feeling free and able to be themselves, and they didn't have the normal constraints. So our places are really exceptionally good for that kind of thing, and I'd like to see us doing more of it. Yeah.
We really were beginning to get on a roll there.
And I did warn you I could talk forever about the National Trust.
And I think that comes through. I think your passion most definitely comes through. We do unfortunately have to draw this evening's lecture to a close, but look, I would very much like to express, I'm sure, our combined thanks for a very educational talk, but I think what resonates with me perhaps even more than what I have learnt about the National Trust, and I have learnt things tonight which I didn't know, is your approach, your openness, your creativity. You've been incredibly frank and honest around the challenges that the National Trust has been and will continue to face, and you're not afraid to address those issues. I think also what's interesting for me has been you avoid prescribing what should happen in certain spaces, and the example just outside Bestbrook was incredibly insightful. I didn't even know it existed somewhere so close to home. But you don't seek to prescribe how spaces should be used, and instead you try to integrate that voice of the community in determining the appropriate use for them, as opposed to what you think it should be. And I think there's lessons in that for all of us, particularly with so much creativity off the back of the pandemic. Exactly working right out what is the right way. It's not just necessarily applying the technologies that we were using, but equally we don't want to just return to the old ways of working, but we need to find some middle ground as to the best way forward, and not impose what we think, whether that's on students or on other people in different environments. I've really loved tonight the diversity in the audience. It's not often you get so many people from such a breadth of backgrounds, and clearly National Trust is something that brings us all together and hopefully creates harmony in the peace and the beauty that it generates. So thank you. We have thoroughly enjoyed your talk. Thank you very much for coming. Couldn't believe you are literally on our doorstep, and we're very proud that actually we have the Director General of the National Trust from Northern Ireland. So Hilary, thank you very much again, and maybe we could show our appreciation. So ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our evening's lecture.